Welcome. I'm Marion Boyer. I'm pleased to welcome you to our panel discussion, Healing Self and Community Through Poetry. Thanks for coming. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because we have from 3 to 4:30 to hear this special conversation. And we want to provide some time for you to interact with the panel. If you'd be so kind right now to turn off your cell phones and electronic devices, that'd be great. Gail Griffiin has been an inspiring and invaluable friend to Kalamazoo Poetry Festival. I'm deeply honored to introduce her today as our moderator, and Gail in turn will introduce her panel. Gail is a professor emeritus from Kalamazoo College. She's published 3 extraordinary nonfiction books and a memoir. She's currently writing a chapbook of fascinating and tender poems in the persona of Elizabeth I of England. Gail not only researches and writes passionately about issues that matter, she is consistently generous, willing to take her energy out into the community. She has championed women and worked hard to illuminate the complexities surrounding spousal abuse. She's co-facilitated workshops to build white anti-racist allies for the local organization SHARE and at the Summit on Racism. Gail currently serves as chair of the YWCA Kalamazoo Board of Directors. She's long been committed to this organization, and she believes, as she told me, that nobody addresses the effects of racism and sexism on the most vulnerable women and children in our community as directly and wholeheartedly as the YWCA. I also want to introduce our signer, Jamie Ricks, standing here to my left. She's an extraordinary signer, and we're very pleased to have her. We're proud to present this panel, and Gail is our moderator. Please help me give them a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Marion, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm so honored and abashed here. After I introduce this stunning panel, I've asked them to bring a poem, their own or somebody else's, that will allow them to kind of enter into this topic of poetry, healing, self, and community, which is, to me, fraught with problems and questions and conundra. Is that the plural of conundrum? I don't even know. And after that, I have some questions for them, but I'm just going to kind of turn them loose to talk to each other. And as Marion said, we're hoping to end our part of this in an hour so that we can hear from you. Many of you, I know, are stunningly well equipped to address this issue. So, I was so thrilled when I was told who these panelists were going to be, because they do remarkable work. They represent widely different corners of our community, and they all intersect around poetry and healing. And I'm just thrilled to have them here today. To my right is Allison Kennedy. Allison is currently the executive director of the Fire Arts Collaborative down on Washington Square, and is doing wonderful work with kids in the Edison neighborhood. She's also the co-founder of Humans Beyond Boxes, which fights for formerly incarcerated people to have a fair chance of employment and rebuilding their lives. Most importantly, much more important than any of that, she was my student. I met her on day 1 of the spring term of her first year in a great big class, where almost immediately I said to myself, yeah, that little one in the back with the blonde shock of hair. Watch out, world. This one's going to come get you. To my left is Michael Evans, the director of the Kalamazoo Literacy Council. Michael provides resources for the 13% of our neighbors who struggle to read, and we all know what kinds of impediments lie ahead of them with that deficiency. He really understands the power of the word. He's worked a lot with kids, with young kids who are in danger of falling off the tracks, and he's done work with young people using the ancient tradition of the praise song by turning it into the praise poem and having the students write essentially songs of praise, affirming their own identities. Next to Michael is Denise Miller, my partner in crime in some of these workshops that Marion mentioned. Denise is a faculty member at Kalamazoo Valley Community College and has been for many years. It seems like she's always teaching 28 courses. I don't know how she does it. She also offers workshops in the culinary arts. She's quite a cook and chef. Offers the anti-racism workshops where we collaborate through SHARE and through other venues. And she's the author most recently of a chapbook, a remarkable chapbook called Ligatures, which is centered on the murders of African Americans in this country in recent years. The chapbook was one of the, I think, 2 runners-up for the Rattle Poetry Chapbook Prize. And it also is part of a whole full-length book that's coming out soon, I hope. Denise is the co-founder of the Fine Arts Collaborative, which Allison has taken over. And on the far left is Joe Cosello. Joe is an Army kid, a combat veteran, was in the U.S. Army for 4 years, has used poetry and music to work with other veterans experiencing trauma after conflict. He was the poetry editor for Asylum Lake magazine, and he's currently an informationist, isn't that a great word, at the WMU Medical School, at the Stryker Medical School at WMU, where he both teaches and works to make information about medical studies more accessible to both the doctors and the students who are hoping to become physicians. So what a diverse crew, and so glad to have them. As I said, I've asked, I've asked each of them to bring a poem that will open some kind of doorway into this topic of poetry, healing, self, and community. So who wants to start? Joe is going to start. I knew Joe was going to be the one to start.
Hello? Oh, okay. Eyes in the Sand. They told us it would be a fun-filled, spiraling descent to thwart attacks upon our well-being and to relax. It should be like a carnival ride, some summer, back home. Our stomachs slowly rose to the stars circling above. As engine sounds drowned prayers, religious ones whispered, clutching their rifles and rosary beads. We landed in a dusty darkness. In other words, whisking quartz tickled our adverts. Maybe I'm dramatic. Maybe people yelling directions on the tarmac while faint orange-yellow flickers resembling candlelights where a silhouette horizon of conflict is a formidable welcome to the land. I felt like an intruder. The most recent shamal the topic in shoot the shit circles, not any dog tags spattered with youthful bloodlust. We programmed. Military camps hide behind barbed wire white picket fences. No family who lost to precision-guided, radio-controlled democracy rise. Stateside, we disseminate to the world another impassioned call for aggressive peacekeeping missions. My boot soles melted as I walked around the first day. When my tears fell, steam smelled like petroleum fire. I always wanted to look directly at the sun, and here I could. The sun was a darker shade of yellow. Playing cards one night, listening to top 40 pop rock, drinking skunky beer sold by Christian profiteers who adore our need for escape, when in bursts a blood-soaked soldier, a young one twirling a desert eagle, sobbing after he mistook Iraq for a grenade and murdered a 14-year-old boy. We label kids slain enemy, combatant. We often fail to protect. Each moon-draped cooling did nothing to calm the pitter-patter barrage of metal rounds rattling the back of our eyelids. The trailer and tent walls move rhythmically as chopper blades thump, 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 hunting people all around us. The smog sky forming another season of distrust. So I chose to read this poem because when I got back from the military, I was met with one of two responses. It was either, thank you for your service, I don't really want to talk about it, or how could you do that? It was right around the time when the weapons of mass destruction weren't there. A lot of people were very skeptical of the war, and I didn't really have an outlet in the community, and I struggled for many years with dissociation and post-traumatic stress. And it was a workshop class with Nancy Eimers that herself leading the workshop, and then a few of the students really evoked me to write about something that was scary, that took some risk, and through that I was able to start healing and integrating with the community a lot more effectively, I felt like. That's why I chose to read that one.
Thanks, great poem. Do we want to just move down the line, Denise?
Okay, I'm going to read.
Denise has like half of a voice.
Thank you. I think I'm going to try to read the one that I read last night again, just because it's pretty much on my heart. It's a persona poem about a woman who was beaten to death by her husband and her husband's friend while her children were made to watch. It's called Bone to Bending Thing. Did they tell you I would lay between your fingers till you played me from a bone to bending thing? Did they say my skin would sing any symphony you slap, if only you snap hard enough? Did they name you God and calendar this the fourth day? Did they tell you fist and baton can whittle rib thick till it's your perfect, clean-picked and sized-up thing? Did they say anything before they taught you to other your children's mother, from lover to prisoner to something black and free you had to tame? Did they tell you that if you broke me, I'd ring a shame-thick, resonant, and broken thing? You thought you played me from a bone to bending thing. Took your fiddled fingers, struck, plucked me, taught, you thought. You tuned me to a voiceless key. You thought if I couldn't speak, you'd make my body sing. You thought you'd played me from a bone to bending thing. Did they say to instrument me, strip fodder from bone, hone Adam's apple to cartilage, marrow to dry? Did they tell you then to make me shine, to bring to bear this skin to our children's eyes, so you could shape me to a shamed and pliant thing? Did they tell you that if you scored me till my skin thinned to crescendo-marked music sheet, that I would keep while they all slept here or wept here? Did they tell you that if you beat me from upright into treble clef, there'd be nothing left to sing? So you thought you'd played me from a bone to bending thing, took your fiddled fingers, struck, plucked me taut, you thought. You tuned me to a voiceless key, you thought. If I couldn't speak, you'd make my body sing. You thought you played me from a bone to bending thing. So the reason that I chose to read that poem again today is because just rereading Audre Lorde's poetry is not a luxury, over and over again lately, and really thinking about the ways in which often, almost always, that abuse of children, of women, of partners is something that happens over and over again. And because it happens so often in so many cases, it gets overlooked because it becomes something usual. And I was going to read from my other book, and not to diminish violence against Black people at all, but I think that because there's so much hidden and there's so much of a large impact on those children who have to watch, and that continued silence that happens, it was really important for me to read that in this instance.
Hello. There are places sometimes that help you get over things. For me, the poem I read yesterday was about that farm that helped me to get past a great many things. But there's also people as well. And the poem that I'm going to read today is about a person who was very, very instrumental in helping me to be here today. The grandfather. So slight a man he was, his back bent from going without too long, providing for others with means of his own making, carting produce and livestock to markets, shoveling coal into train cars, railroaded, redlined, passed over, but undeterred. The grandfather. Lessons so easily learned just by being near him, safe in his shadow, close enough to glean wisdom from his whispered prayers. Well, Lord, he would say, and what would be simply would be. The hard without the bitter, kindness without expectation of return, service without complaint, to family, to anyone, needing nothing for himself but to breathe. Every day, his normal was glorious. The grandfather. From him was learned how real men work, how real men love. To do his work, once he trusted me to do it, such an honor. The weight of obligation lifted from his shoulders to mine, a grateful burden borne with pride. Unworthy as I am, his lessons he taught well, knowing that example is the best teacher, and a legacy of worth comes from those who do more than they say. Rest easy, grandfather. So great a man he was. So this man was the person who I had in my life as the example of how to live after things, after your mother's murdered, after your father's imprisoned for life, after you've seen wrong and you don't have any reasons of why. And with him, we were able to see past that. So that was the grandfather.
Wow. Adjustment. She leaves me blurry with only what's in front of me. An audience of glasses all staring at me in pairs. I'm just one person though. Since August, I feel like less. She returns in her white coat and I close my eyes. May I? She says. Oh. And she pauses. I open my eyes. I mean, yes, of course. Her hands guide my glasses like a good pilot who wakes no passengers while leaving or landing. My neck unnumbs and my scalp blushes. Her nails skim my temples like clouds. The warm frame is the first compliment in months. The first picture I don't want to rub myself out of. For so long, I scooched them up my nose, allowed them to fall every time I looked down, and I have been looking down so often. May I? Is this better? Does this feel good to you? The first kind questions I've heard someone say before touching my body since August. I think I've been finding, I'm trying to really hone in on those small moments, and those moments, using poetry to recognize those moments of healing or change, especially as I'm working more with young folks. And after a few months of writing poems that are just, they're endless with grief, endless. And I find that in my own way. trying to find the tiny.
Thanks. It's so great that all four of them are poets, too. And if you were here last night, you know how good they are. And now you know even more. So when I did a kind of very cursory web search about poetry and healing, I was really surprised by what I found. I found a lot of Mary Oliver poems. And all props and all respect to Mary Oliver, because one of her poems has been on my refrigerator for years. And you probably know, if you know her work, you know which one it is. But the context was people talking about being soothed, finding rest, and finding escape. And I sent off some commentary on that issue to these four people, and I said, wow, I really, I understand the power of poetry to soothe. I even understand it as an escape. But my healing through poetry, if there is such a thing, doesn't come that way. How about you? So I wonder if any of you want to comment on what kind of healing poetry can offer and what kind, if you wish, what kind it cannot offer. Do you have opinions about that?
Sure. This is a fascinating topic to me because what I recognized through a Fetzer grant, I got to work with songwriting with soldiers. And the veterans that are traumatized come in just stoic. They can handle anything. They don't want to talk about anything. This is too sensitive and all these sorts of things. And what I recognized was that through the process of trying to reconstruct or maybe tap into their memories and figure out how the narrative plays out with some emotionality attached to the objective memory, they were able to start feeling some disruptive feelings, I guess. And it was the sharing of that, what I called social anchoring, that was really the transformation that occurred. So I feel like poetry offers a route to usher yourself into the emotionality of a past event, and then through the sharing of it, you're able to anchor yourself within a community again.
I think if anyone knows me, they know I love James Baldwin, and I quote him everywhere I go. And this is another moment for that for me. I think about when he said the role of the artist is the same as the role of the lover, to make you conscious of what you don't see, and that's the highest form of love for a community. And James Baldwin's kind of love isn't an easy love, but it's a real love. And I feel like when I think about poetry, I think about it as the opportunity for an individual to heal. Clearly, in my opinion, I should say, the only way for a person to heal is to find a way, often to piece themselves back together. And part of that piecing back together is unearthing the hard stuff. And to unearth the hard stuff for me and to speak it, to claim it, to take it in like poison and put it out like medicine is poetry. And I think that's true not just for the individual, but for communities. Baldwin also talked a lot about how communities can only heal when they look at the truth. And oftentimes, I mean, I always joke when I have a reading, you probably won't laugh at my poetry. It's always pretty tough. But the only way that I think communities can heal is to tell the truth, and I think that's the job for me of my poetry.
For me, it's poetry is it's power. Something happens. You didn't have any control over that. Something was taken. Some damage was done to you. Trauma you experienced. But with poetry, you have the opportunity to reinterpret it in your own terms. Share it at your own pace. Revisit it in ways where you can see it more clearly than when it first happened. Put it into perspective and grow from it. So for me, the ability to be able to have regret, but revisit it in a way where you can get past it because you have those words to speak to people who may not even be there. You can say thank you to people who you wish you still could. You can ask for forgiveness or give forgiveness without even seeing the person and feel the results. So for me, poetry just gives you the opportunity to take those terrible things that happen to any one of us and gives you power and authority over that event to not be defined by it, but determine how you will emerge from it.
You don't have to, you can pass if you don't want to answer my questions.
Wow, I'm really taking this in. I feel like a lot of me is really intimidated by the word healing. I'm like, that's heavy. That's gonna take a few generations. There's a part of me that's like when I'm like, all right, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna light this candle. I'm gonna get out the journal. I'm gonna cry for a while. It's like, woo, it's really, at the open mics at Fire, wow. Since I got the job, so many people would come and share and cry, and it'd be so full. And I remember sometimes, like the first few months afterwards, I would just collapse after. And I would just lay there and like cry in some ways. Yeah, I'm just really struck by how alone and together healing needs to be. In some ways, I think that I've heard many people tell me before, a poem isn't a job. I'll write poems, Allison, but I'm still homeless. Like I've heard that very frank, continual thing come. And I think there's, in some ways, I just came here to breathe very deeply into the microphone.
You're doing a fine job.
Okay. So, yeah, I guess that, I think, yeah, there's a part of me that recognizes there's a deep systematic healing that poetry is a part of, and I am also aware there's something else. I would not say more or less, but there's something in that too. And though that poetry is a very real part of that, from what I've seen and witnessed, and just in my own experience. I think if I hadn't found poetry at like 16, I would still be, whew. I think I wouldn't love myself, or see many of the people in this room.
So is healing the wrong word? I mean, are we coming at this? I keep hearing that, the voice of the kid who says, yeah, this has been great, but I'm still homeless. Has poetry healed that kid? Or are we looking at something else? I don't even know. But anybody who has a thought, Joe.
Well, not to respond to that, just to take a second to reflect on what everybody responded to the first prompt. I'm curious about, you mentioned confronting truth, and maybe healing isn't the appropriate word, but I know from working in medicine, a lot of the physicians talk about visiting patients on the worst days of their lives, and they get to hear stories that those patients haven't shared with their closest family and friends. And so they're really into this. Somebody recently said about narratives in medicine that your training isn't about gaining competencies, but it's about gaining a ticket to the threshold of life. And I'm really curious about what the panelists think, and everybody, honestly, what we feel about art, because there is so much emotionality in it and so much truth, that you experience a little bit of vicarious trauma just by hearing the plight of somebody else. And then we need to take a second to heal ourselves before we can even respond sometimes. So I'm just curious, especially as teachers and mentors, you hear a lot of these people's accounts, and how do you process or take care of yourself hearing all those stories?
I'm not sure. I mean, marvelous questions. I think about, the thing that made me feel like I have a response is thinking about how do I heal myself. Sometimes I take in so many stories, and I know Allison takes in a lot of stories from being in that same place for a while, and sometimes it's hard not to let them sit there in my stomach or in my heart. I always said that I would have been a therapist if I could handle holding all of those stories. But I don't know. I think that poetry for me is a way of exercising. I mean, literally exercising. I think about what happened. The reason why I wrote Ligatures, the last book that Gail talked about, and I literally wrote the first half of it, the chapbook version, in a matter of weeks, only because there was a moment after another person was shot, I think it was after Laquan McDonald was shot, that I didn't really want to get out of bed. I didn't want to go teach. I didn't want to, there's this joke, but it's really real. I wanted to call in black to work because I couldn't stand it again, you know? It was so hard to get up and keep moving because it was personal for me. And it was also something I knew my students might want to talk about. And I was dealing with the personal, and I wanted to be able to deal with the personal first. And the only way I could do it is start writing. And people said, well, how can you write? How did you survive writing that book? The only way I survived was by writing that book. And so for me, surviving, I'm going to try to figure out a different word for surviving, but right now I don't have it in me. It might come out later. But living through that, the only way I could live through it and to keep, and I keep going back to taking in poison and making it medicine, that's the only way that I could do it. And even as a teacher, there was a moment I said I was like 15 years into teaching, and I decided I was gonna become a massage therapist as well, because I needed during that time to be able to take in hard stories and somehow find a way of continuing to feed myself and feed other people. Like I felt like that was a tangible way of healing that I didn't always see in my teaching, because you don't always know your impact until later or maybe never. And it can be a profession where you can get pretty beaten up as well, regardless of if it's about you. So anyway, I think poetry becomes that massage for me too. Poetry becomes that outlet. The only way that I can stay in this place, this world sometimes, is to be able to write out the hard stuff.
I think the question was, is healing the right word? I think it is, but it's also what can poetry do for healing. If you're on fire, you want someone to put the fire out. A poem's not going to do that. But what poetry can do is it can give you a place to put your response to all of those things. And for me, it's almost like in the beginning, it's a cemetery where you can place some of those difficult things. And in your time of your choosing, you can revisit it. You can be intimate with it, and you can walk away from it. And the important thing, at least for some of us, is if you live there, you have to be able to walk away from it. So this is a way to, first of all, give it a place where you can lay it to rest, but revisit it because it's still a part of you. That part to me is healing. I think it would be an overstatement to say a person who is in real, serious, continuous harm, that a poem is going to fix that. the first thing you do when you're in real serious harm is make the harm stop. So it's a part of it, but it's not the immediate thing in all of those circumstances. So at least for me, and the types of things that I personally had to overcome, it was a good place to be able to put it. And I never really shared it. It was for me. It's where am I going to put all of these things? And I found that being able to write it, first of all, made it real, but it also put it someplace that wasn't here. It wasn't on me. I have endeavored to be able to walk without having any of that visible on me. And most people who know me, you wouldn't see, oh my gosh, how did you? That's not what I want. So it's given me an opportunity to be able to say it's there, but I revisit it on my own choosing. When I teach praise poems, I really do this so that individuals have an opportunity to reinterpret themselves in a way of their own choosing and deliver their best version of themselves, as opposed to I'm going to give you the poem about everything that's hard. Sometimes that happens, but this is your opportunity when you're restating who you are in a way of your own choosing. And it also gives you victory over whatever it was that made you feel so low at any time. So yes, it does heal, but it doesn't heal everything.
I want to chime in here and just touch on what you just said, Michael, and Joe said something about it a while back about writing being a way of putting a frame around something that interprets it through your own being, your own eyes, your own brain, your own spirit, your own heart, so that the thing becomes your own. And the thing may not go away, you know? You're still homeless. But in some way, there is, I think for those of us who write, that's the supercharge, that's the power. That rush that comes from putting that chaotic picture in a frame and seeing what's in it take shape, a shape that we've found for it. That's a really important moment for an artist, I think. I want to ask, those of you who work with other people, who do writing with other people, and that's pretty much all four of you, can you tell us some stories about the difference you've seen in people when they come to that moment of power through writing, poetry or otherwise?
Sure. Most recently, I've been helping out with arts and medicine program at the med school. It's a thread of medical humanities, and we come together just to bring the medical students to talk about difficult experiences that they have in the clinic environments, to start the habit of finding healthy routes to cope with the vicarious trauma that they're seeing and their own challenges in life. And we always set it up where you come in and there's no poetry with a big P or writing with a big W. It's all collaborative, it's workshopy, we work on each other's pieces and whatnot, and it's very low barrier. And what was most exciting recently was hearing one of the med students say, "Well, I've known all of you for 2 years, but I didn't really know you." And I think that was pretty remarkable in that just even by sharing parts of themselves with other people's works, they were able to come together and transform into a stronger community. And I think that was something that was, I don't know, pretty remarkable.
I think for me, when I have had the most joy and fulfillment was working with young people who had similar issues as I had, getting kicked out of school, and you really have a reason for acting out. It's not that you just decide that you want to be the bad kid. There's something that provoked you into that moment. So here they are, kicked out of school, or at the juvenile home, or at the Michigan Youth Challenge Academy, or any other place, and they've been defined by that now. You are the bad kid. You are the one who's in trouble. You are probably for the rest of your life in some way marked by this as being on your second or third strike. You're that close to being much more disposable. And that's how it could be interpreted. But in teaching praise poems, you have the opportunity to reject that first, but then restate who you are, beginning with a very simple statement. I am. And everything after that defines who you are. And you can live up to that every day. That's something to me that gives hope out of whatever circumstance. And at the end of summer, I worked with a group of kids who were assigned to me, and we were doing all types of arts projects. But at the end of their presentation, to show all of the accomplishments of their work, they had these praise poems. We called it a praise poem pageant, each one, similar to what we had last night, except all of them were stating their praise poems. And you would see these kids who were supposedly bad kids telling you who they really were. And for their parents, they saw for the first time what real potential could come from them if given the opportunity to see the good and share that good, as opposed to always saying, well, this is because you did this, or you are a terrible person because you did that, or I have to watch you because you might do that. So if you listened to that, you saw these kids able to state what their intentions were to the world. And that's powerful. And you would say to anyone that if that's what you want to do, if that's what you intend to do for this planet, you are worthy. And that is huge. To see the pride in these young people to say, I can because I am more than what was before me.
Wow. Yeah, it's such a privilege to witness people change through writing. And I think that's something that, yeah, I feel very deeply that, like, I was reminded when my family came to an event at Fire, and something they said was, it felt like I was having a heart attack the whole time. And I was like, why? And they were like, well, it was so emotional and so real. And I think about how the ways in which I've been part of poetry communities has allowed me to listen and to gain so much perspective, and in some ways build a pretty high emotional capacity, or have had to set a lot of boundaries. And yeah, that's something that not everyone has. And to see people really take off. Often I feel like I'm taken off in it. We're all like, oh, I'm trying to heal too. And I mean, it can go from a young person at Fire. We had two young women who had said when they came to me, like, I haven't cried in 6 years. I just want to know who I am. I'm 16 and I feel tired already. And seeing them then transform into being able to feel through their poetry, through cipher and drumming, and seeing like that fullness. Wow, that's really powerful to witness. And a lot of it too, it's her own. I love that about poetry too, is it can be people's own thing. It doesn't belong to someone else. I think that because it's so much about someone's voice and experience, it's not like, okay, you were part of the program, now you're better now. I don't know where I got that experience in my life, but that's how often I felt, of like, okay, I did the Type to Learn program. Now I can type better. Now I'm a better human. But I feel like with poetry, it's personal enough where people really feel the claim on, like, I did the work here. I wrote. Allison just gave a weird question. And, like, that's also powerful.
Yeah, I think similarly, just real quickly, having worked with people of all different ages, elementary school up to people in their 80s, and in different situations, the YWCA, school, fire, the other, schools, and just thinking about how I think people, what I've seen most with poetry is people becoming more themselves. Oftentimes, well, lately I've been working with people who, all the way from my dear friend Jim, who most of you know, into the students in my class this semester, people who didn't ever really write poetry lately. I've been working with a lot of people like that. And all of them have said that when they've brought out stories, like a young woman in my class just recently, her stepbrother committed suicide, and she'd never written about it. She wasn't even really writing, but she couldn't really talk about it. And the opportunity to write that by just giving a weird prompt just really settled herself more in who she was by reclaiming her brother and his place in her life and the truth of his story. And I think that's been true. It's such an odd semester. I think I've had the best class of my life with all of these students who, when they wrote their paper, just talked about how much writing helped them to discover and be more of who they really are. And for me, I think that's a kind of healing that's really usually significantly important. And I was just thinking about what you were talking about healing, and I was thinking about, all of you can see my knee injury up here probably, and I played football and got my knee blown out, and the injury is healed. Actually, it healed really quickly, the doctor said, quicker than most, but I didn't go back to playing sports after that. So there was one level of healing that happened, one piece of me that I got back, but there are still pieces that I'm recovering. And I feel like that's sort of what's happening with me with poetry, working with people, and that's happening with me with poetry as well. So I think the ING is the most important part of the healing. It's like, it's always occurring. It just depends on what level you're seeking.
I just want to underscore something here. The prevailing notion that I found in my web search about poetry as soothing and as escape, as a nice back rub in some way, or a pretty picture. And I'm exaggerating, but you hear that a lot, and those assumptions exist about poetry. These people are saying pretty much the opposite. Instead of poetry being a path away from something, it's a circling back to something. And what I want to suggest is that, for me anyway, rather than healing, what poetry does is rehumanize us. I mean, instead of making us feel good, it makes us feel fully, or the best poetry does. I'm thinking about Joe working with people who have been deliberately dehumanized in order to do the work of war. And then being expected to come back and be functioning human beings again. It's completely illogical, completely destructive, and it's, thank God for people like Joe, who sort of lead them back to feelings in an environment where they can be felt without exploding. And I think of Denise writing her chapbook from a culture where Black lives, let's face it, don't matter. They may matter to us individually, but collectively, in terms of our values, they don't seem to matter. And writing as if every single lost life matters. And of course it does. And I'm thinking of what Michael said about the kids getting to say who they are apart from what they've been convicted of by schools or justice system or parents or authorities. In other words, reinventing themselves as humans, remembering who they are apart from their infractions or their mistakes or whatever. And imagine losing touch with your humanity by the time you're 12 years old. I mean, that's amazing. And then, of course, Allison down there in the Edison neighborhood with somebody who hasn't cried for 6 years. Do we want to make the child cry again? No, of course not. We don't add to her pain, but we also know if she doesn't feel her feelings, she's well on the way to dehumanization. And poetry and the safe and loving and supportive structure at FIRE, which I've been a little bit of a part of, enables her to do that. So that kind of leads me to the link between the individual aspect of poetry and the collective, self and others. Joe, you said in your work, in the workshop you were in with veterans suffering with PTS, it wasn't just the writing, it was the sharing of the writing. And I wonder if you and or anybody else wants to talk about that collective part of poetry. In the Western world, for a long time, for several hundred years, we've been working with the notion of poetry as deeply private, our deep little inner feelings that are shared only with ourselves. And it has its power there too. I mean, Michael said that. It has its power there too. But poetry comes out of a real collective tradition that's much older than that. And where are we finding that connection between the personal power of poetry and the larger power for the group or the society or the people?
Yeah, so I feel like, as far as I know, Canada was the only country to start this, but when their soldiers are finished with their term and deployment, they don't send them directly home. They actually send them somewhere neutral and remote to just spend a week talking about what happened amongst one another, and they saw significant reductions in suicide attempts. When soldiers return, so I mean, I like research, so I'm gonna get a little researchy here. There's this theory of motivation, a taxonomy that was built by Ryan and Deci in 2000, and it maps this locus of causality. And what I feel like veterans experience when they're transitioning into the service is this removal of onus of self-worth from the person themselves, and it's given to their hierarchy or their leadership, and they're constantly seeking approval from their leadership and seeking validation from their leadership. And it's practical, right? You want people to follow orders, especially in combat scenarios. But then when soldiers are transitioning out, they're not given their self-worth back. It's still somewhere out there. And so a lot of veterans will dissociate, or they will hide from any sort of authority figure that doesn't seem appropriate. And they themselves won't have control of their own experiences. So through the songwriting events that I was lucky enough to be part of, it felt like the first challenge was just asking the veteran to open up a little bit and share some of their experiences. And then the art was the vehicle that told the story on behalf of the soldier. And they had final approval for all their songs. And there's other art pieces in there, photography and whatnot. But the veteran gets, or the spouse gets final approval, so it really is their story then being shared. And when they saw the community receive it and get emotional and it get published, they're all ASCAP certified songs. The veterans seem to feel like there's a release of that payload, and they feel a little bit better. And I've spoken with veterans that credit one song with saving their life, and to me that's remarkable that the work that folks can do in any field of art could save somebody's life just by telling one story.
I think that there's a special place where this type of poetry lives. But for me, I was kind of a reluctant poet, and I didn't want to be a poet. Still, when I sit around what I call real poets, I go, yes, I can write poetry, but that was not what I wanted to see as my identity. But poetry has a special place where other things won't deal with it. So you can go to the doctor, you're not going to get this. You can even go to a social worker, you're still not going to get this. So it does have a unique place. Reluctant or not, it is something that is powerful. But the other side, when I'm working with the praise poem, is the tradition that I was taught in is it's not meant for you, it's meant for you to restate publicly who you are. So it's an affirmation of who you are. It's not meant to be mine, it's meant to be, here I am. And hopefully at that point you can accept that these are your brothers and sisters as opposed to what you thought you had. So all of a sudden you have all of these proud, capable, optimistic, powerful people when you might have thought before as a community you see delinquents, dropouts, knuckleheads. That's not who they really have. So I do think that in sharing poetry in more of an oral tradition, it gives you an opportunity to, as a community, say, well, here's who we are. And that was why when we were doing the praise poems and it was a pageant, it was just a relentless march of, here's another awesome person for the planet who you might not have known. Here's another person who has great gifts, talents, and abilities that are going to be brought forth. Let's watch them do it. Let's help them do it. So it gives you the opportunity, if you choose, to go through a process to change collectively as a community to say that we, through them, sometimes at the lowest of them, can be so much greater. So that's why the praise poem is really, it's specifically designed to focus on praise over pain. Praise over whatever was. Different than maybe some of the introspective work, but equally, I think, impressive.
I know that I wouldn't be writing if I wasn't sharing. I wouldn't be writing poetry right now if I wasn't able to be out sharing that work. And part of that, for me, and it's weird to say because I'm terrified always of being on stage, but I know for me, when I first started writing poetry, I grew up in a very household full of alcohol, drugs, sexual abuse, domestic abuse, all of that. And I needed to write then because I couldn't talk about it, so I needed to write it out. But, and really I didn't start writing it out completely until I was in college and away from what was happening before I used to draw. But I think somewhere in 2000 or 2002 is when I started writing persona poetry. And I initially was writing poetry in the voices of my family because I realized after a lot of years of therapy, it wasn't getting those stories out for me. I was still holding it. So I needed to talk to those people that I couldn't talk to before. And I needed them to tell me why they did what they did, why they stayed, why they fought, why they drank. And so then I had them talking to each other. And I've been writing persona poetry for the most part ever since. And it shifted from me figuring out my life to me telling the stories of other people that were dehumanized or that weren't heard from. And now I realize, and it took a big push for me to get on stage and then a big push for me to do improv poetry, which I feel like I'm most in my healing self when that happens now. But long story short, I know that I wouldn't be writing if I wasn't reading because there's something in the reading of it. There's something in the sharing of it. There's something in that sort of physicality of putting it out there that's transformative. And I think in part, I remember I wrote a poem, my mom died when I was 1, and I could never write about it until probably about 12 years ago. And the poem was, I thought, horrible, but I read it anyway in this group. And someone came up after and said, thank you for writing that. This is the first time I could cry about the loss of my mother. And some switch flipped then. And so there's something in the naming of injustice that I think transforms community. There's something in the sharing of truth that I think transforms community. And in all of that, it transforms the individual at the same time. So it's a special kind of therapy. It's a special kind of moment and a special kind of healing for me that I really can't articulate well, but I know that it's real. And just in this moment is the first time I realized that if I couldn't get the work out there, I wouldn't be writing it.
Want to chime in?
Yeah, I think that there's something really powerful about the balance of private and public. And one thing I love to tell our young people is like, which do you think is older, written word or spoken word? And they're like, written word, it seems ancient. And I'm like, no. Oh, sorry, I promise I say it in a different way. I ask lots of questions. Don't just tell them things. But spoken word, oral tradition, oral history is, it's been with us for so long. From griots and Homer, I don't know. And I think there's something really important when that's unlocked. And I think about, just the public witnessing. I grew up in slam culture, a very competitive youth slam culture, which also was not golden in a lot of ways. I think it's really important that there's healthy boundaries for young people in open mic spaces. Yes, and I'm very aware that something juicy happens when we're heard. And that there's so much self-silencing. I mean, I constantly all day I'm like, oop, just edit that, oops, And it's kind of refreshing to go to get it out there and to also have it not be contained on paper sometimes, even though a container can be really refreshing and it can be like, I chose this. This is how it's going to look. Sometimes it's really refreshing to just take it to a whole space. I remember being in high school and literally wearing a backpack and running 4 miles to an open mic and arriving really sweaty and being like, oh my God, I'm here. And then just being like, okay, I got 3 minutes. And just it feeling open. I remember the first time I walked to Fire in town, and it was so much further than I thought it was. Then when I got there, I was just like, whoa. But just that people come for that. Sometimes I'm surprised. Oh, and listening. When people listen with their whole bodies, it's so exciting.
I have good news for you. The self-censor starts to vanish around your 60th birthday. It's just fucking wonderful. That was an example. We need to turn over to the audience. Because I just have to do this sometimes. I'm understanding more as a result of this hour with you brilliant people why poetry is always up against it in the United States of America. Most recently, well, you know. And I see this huge conflict between the power of poetry that's being described here and the official values in our society. One is the conflict between the I and the we, which is always fighting it out in the United States. Individual versus society. As Michael's story made clear, that's such a false division. Other cultures don't operate that way, and poetry doesn't operate that way. It's a path between the I and the we. The affirmation of the I becomes the embrace of the we. So if that's the healing that poetry offers, let it be, as a famous British poet once wrote, let it be, let it be, let it be. Whisper words of wisdom. On that note, what would you all like to say about this poetry and healing thing? Do you have questions for these panelists? Comments on anything you heard today? Take it away. Just speak loudly, because I have 2 hearing aids. Yes.
Well, I turned 60 a year or two ago, so thank you. Thank you so much for each of your truth and your authenticity. And just to echo, I love poetry. I always have loved poetry. I can remember when I was a child growing up in Benton Harbor, the librarian said, "Doug, you just need to stand in this stairwell and cry out." And thank God for a librarian that picked up on a young boy that needed to share his feelings. Echoes of what you say from the tradition, my vocation, just let you know that I love poetry. I love poetry, but I also have a vocation, and in the language of my vocation, it echoes some of the poetry of what you're saying. For example, a sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible grace. The Greek word aletheia for truth means authenticity. I can remember a Shakespeare professor at University of Michigan who said the end of all thought is wonder and praise. The Psalms being a place where we praise, but we also can share lament. The prophets speaking authenticity, speaking in the political sense of what is real. And so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and nothing was made without the Word, the power of the Word. And then, Joe, you were asking what brings healing. For me, what brings healing is beauty, and losing my self in something beyond myself, in something that takes me into a new world. And part of that comes from just, you've put it so well, Gail, authenticity of both the praise and the joy and the sorrow. But thank you. Echoing in another poetic language, something that connects us with the world and a power that heals.
I want to express my gratitude for everything that you have contributed to my own thinking. I've used poetry as a road to self-discovery, and I used it as a method of teaching, both at the junior high school and the senior high school, and also at the college level. I found that students are not empty vessels that need to be filled. They're not empty slates that need to be written on. I always said that we are a community to share. You teach me what you know, and I share what I know. So when we ended up using poetry as a means of studying history, I gave them the vehicle of self-expression and making a commitment and learning about history by relating to it, not just hearing about it, memorizing whatever they heard and spitting it back on a test. No, they actually, I said, make it your own history. Become a part of it. Become a part of the community. Become a part of this culture. Embrace what is good and help to correct what needs to be corrected. And fortunately, I had a lot of good students, and they still are very grateful. I'm still in touch with a lot of them after many, many years, and they still talk about writing poetry.
Marcia's our mic runner, among other things.
Yeah, Denise, I wanted to thank you for the correlation between massage therapy and poetry. I've been a clinical massage therapist 25 years, and there is just a deep depth about personal touch and safe touch as it relates to poetry. And I can't put it into words right now, but as you were saying it, it really made sense to me, because I deal with people with like tangible pain, hip replacements, multiple sclerosis, things like that. But I also deal a lot with people with emotional pain. And there's a real transparency. When I write poetry and I'm crafting my words, there's a transparency that I see within myself. And it breaks down those barriers as I kind of grope for words and seek some continuity in the poem. But as I work with people that have been wounded physically and emotionally, and they can come to me and they know that they're going to receive a safe zone. There's safe touch. When they release emotionally on the table, I look for words that are poetic. I look for words that have meaning in their lives. And I just, as you were saying that, it just kind of blew me away, because I mean, I dug it completely. There is this deep correlation between safe touch and poetry.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Phil, for helping me to hopefully make sense of that comment that I made. When you were saying that, I was realizing that the process with massage, I think you helped me to articulate a little bit more inside myself. There's safe touch in that process, but when we're massaging, we're also touching people who are in pain. So the process to get to that touch being safe is trust that going through the hard stuff is going to make you better. It is going to make you feel better. And so, you know, being on that table, it might be a scary moment in the first place because someone is in pain, whether it's mentally or physically. And that part of the touch that's difficult initially helps to transform what might have been negative in the first place into something transformative. And so thank you for sharing that.
I think we'll have to do a trade sometime. How's that?
I would absolutely love that.
Amen. Amen to that, sister.
What time are you done today?
I would just like to also add to that even in the massage as well as in poetry, in the creative process, anytime there's a sense of hope, as someone would leave the table, there's hope to feel better. Finishing, reading a poem, writing a poem, there's hope in that expression, and that's what keeps us motivated.
You know, it's interesting. You may or may not know that since the election, there's been an explosion of websites, magazines, gatherings, readings that are about the poetry of resistance. Both bringing back poems of the past that have resisted power and authority, and also the writing of new poetry. And oddly enough, that poetry has just about the only thing that's made me hopeful. Because round about December, I was feeling quite hopeless, as I think a number of Americans were. And when I read the poetry that touches my sense of hopelessness or rage or anguish, oddly enough, I feel hopeful. I mean, it's paradoxical, but I think it follows on what you were saying.
I was just thinking of a couple of things. One of them was, yeah, I wrote this poem, but I'm still homeless. And is healing the right word? And I think, I think they go together. Because I think that being able to express those feelings, being able to express that trauma, being able to objectify it on a page and look at it, being able to share it, I think as a teacher or as a guide, that's what we want people to be able to do, is to get through whatever it is. But you have to have hope in order to do that. And when I hear other people's experiences with trauma, then I know I'm not alone. That we all collectively, like you were talking about, have shared that maybe not the same exact experience, but the feelings involved in that experience.
I'm thinking about this use of the word healing too. And I taught freshman writing and creative writing at Cleveland State for some years. And I taught as part of the university faculty, registered college students, but also Cleveland State's Poetry Center, which is at Cleveland State, has a community program called Imagination 2, which is creative writing just for people in the community who are not registered college students. It was a very affordable class. It was a workshop, community workshops. So they would send us out, and we had different locations around the city, so it wasn't just on campus, but maybe in a neighborhood for people that wouldn't actually have the ability to transport themselves to campus very easily. But one of the most beautiful things that I saw then was the communities that would form. It wasn't any magic I was doing, or I was the poet and I co-taught it with a fiction writer. It was sort of a generic creative writing class. But you'd have this mix of people like a young woman who had been in the revolution in Iran. She was a teenager, and she would share her horrific experiences along with kids from Parma, younger people from Parma who didn't have problems, anything like that, first world problems. And the connections that they would make by sharing these, poetry or a short story, often they were very, like most people who start writing fiction initially, it's very autobiographical. So they would learn these things about each other, and so they were disparate ages. They might be 16, they might be 75, in the same group. And these great, unique little communities, there was just healing there, watching these relationships form. And they would get so fond of each other, they would arrange to meet after the work. Like they would run for like eight times. We met 8 times. They would bring cameras at the last workshop and take group pictures of each other and be up against the wall and make me take their picture, then make me be in the class, take their picture. That was one of the most beautiful things. And I was thinking, as Denise was saying, she's realizing it on the spot here, if you didn't have people to write with and for, kind of, would you, if there's no one to hear, would you be speaking in any sort of way? So I think that I can't say they were totally healed, of the trauma they'd been through, but man, there's magic happening there. There always was.
I think, at least for me, when I hear poetry and healing, especially when we were first asked about it, I wasn't thinking, well, that's what it does. But one thing I do know it does is it gives you the opportunity to name it. You can bring eloquence to the ugly, and now you own it, but you have actually started to direct it. But it gives you a way to define what happened in a way where there is beauty. I mean, there's so many things that are wrong that if you describe them using the dictionary, you would say, well, wow, I would never want to say that about you. I would never want to say that that is you. But then when you put a poetic voice behind it, you can say, I would love to be able to get to know you. I am so proud of you that you were able to overcome that. So I do think that there is a place where that healing takes place. It's just different than a clinical sense. It's something else. So I do definitely feel that there is that connection. And when you talk about it being grouped in different community groups and how it actually evolves when it gets out there, that's when it becomes that thing that nothing else actually becomes. That's poetry. That's what language does when you share it. It's not a shot you got in the arm. It became something else, and it grows in such a way that it becomes bigger than what it is. It's a movement as opposed to a function. So.
This is, the several voices remind me of a moment when Fetzer provided some funding for me to go work with the traumatized soldiers. The gentleman that had started this program, he initially started working with homeless teens in New Jersey to try to get their stories out, and then he transitioned more into domestic violence and then ultimately with soldiers. But he says when you go deep enough, you reach some area where it's a common truth for all of us. It's some sort of primal elements, and it really resonated with me because I felt like for so long I was trying to talk like an artist, or I was trying to talk like a professional, or I just didn't really understand language, I think. But more specifically, I didn't really understand authenticity and hope. And many years ago, I was lucky enough to interview Denise, and she maybe doesn't remember the interview, but I can't remember the third one, but it was no red, no rhymes, and no hearts. And I thought that was so fascinating because when someone starts in any artistic process, I feel like the first few moments is just a vomiting up of woe is me. And once you get through that process, you start to recognize there's no way to duplicate my experiences. We just don't have that opportunity. So you are truly unique. And if you don't share your story with us, then how are we ever supposed to know you? And to me, that was what was so remarkable, is that at the second or third retreat that I was at, I felt pretty comfortable with my story, and one of the songwriters really wanted to write another song, and we ended up collaborating, and there was just this one section of the song where I talked to them about when I was a child, we used to try to outrun the sun. So we were in Arizona, and we would see who could make it all the way to the sidewalk from the garage door without jumping in the grass because it was a zillion degrees outside. And we used to catch frogs. And when he heard that line, he just instantly started crying because it reminded him of his childhood in West Texas. And so I think there's something powerful about just recognizing that as scary as it feels or as risky as it may feel, that sharing that part of yourself with everybody really does help us understand you better.
I'm thinking more of the word redeeming than healing, because sometimes one uses writing to take an experience and redeem something from it, and you don't necessarily think of yourself as needing healing, but needing to draw something from the experience which changes it and redeems it. And I did that when my husband had a stroke right in midlife, and was a professor and wrote a lot and talked a lot and loved what he did, and suddenly he could no longer do that. And so I didn't think of writing as healing so much as pulling something from that.
Well, I definitely think writing has, I think the reading, the performing, has an opportunity to redeem culture, redeem communities. I think a lot about, I draw from a lot of history in my own work as well, and in part because I feel like there's so many atrocities that have happened historically that for us to really look at those atrocities as a community and have to address those. If you're, reading, I was really happy that Rattle picked up my book because I didn't think anyone would touch it. I didn't think they'd want to deal with that history or that present. But by doing that, it's a way of redeeming, because people have an opportunity to name what happened, to deal with it, and to shift it. And so the shifting, I think the healing is the dealing with. And then the shifting, making it different, not repeating those same things after, that's the redemption.
Hello. I'd just like to start by thanking you all for your wisdom. It's been really interesting. My name's McKenna. Hi. I've lived a very comfortable life, and for a long time I thought that I couldn't write poetry, or at least good poetry, because I didn't have anything super traumatic happen to me that inspires so many good poets. So I really appreciate what you guys say about poetry being a way to find yourself. And that's one thing I love about poetry, is because it's for everybody, because everybody has a self to find. So I thank you guys. It was good.
I think part of healing is it's a journey. And when we go through life's journey, we look for hope. And when we hear words of poetry, I think we are able to behold it and to put a name to it and to reunite or rejuvenate that fire that has been burnt away. I resonated with what you were saying about physicians. I work with physicians, and they're always on this high pedestal of having to heal people through medicine, that they lose themselves because that's what we've taught them to do. You can't have any emotional impact when you watch somebody die, and allowing them to understand people and to be a part of people. It's pretty powerful. So.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I talk to the attendings a lot about that. I see a lot of similarities with the military and medicine. It's very hierarchical. You're seeing trauma all day. And so one of the things that I do, much to the chagrin of the older docs, is call them by their first name. I mean, just something to bring them down to earth a little bit. But at the same time, I feel like they are often criticized for being indecisive. Not in family medicine as much or community medicine, but if you're on the ICU and a physician says, well, I don't really know about that, the family gets very upset. So that there's a shift right now happening in medicine to regain control of their domain from suits. And there's a movement of slow doctoring, and this movement just is their attempt to really protect themselves and that relationship with the patients. So we're promoting vulnerability, starting as soon as the M1s begin. We have the humanities there, but I really feel like it's important to work with those older physicians as well, because they're carrying around such burden.
My husband is a physician, and he actually works at the VA. And he's in a special program that is when people are returning currently from any of the wars out there. He's working with those people. And the tragedy that he carries now and the silence that he brings home with it is something I've never noticed with him in medicine before, because it's such powerful stuff. And you see some of the vets come home and they're destroyed.
Is there anyone else who would like to raise a question or testify? Oh, good. In the true sense of the word.
Thank you. Earlier when we were talking, or you all were discussing whether or not healing is the right word, I was reminded of being in college, where I found myself in therapy for very old trauma. And of course, way far into it, I was getting really frustrated because I didn't seem to be getting better. And I was expressing this to my therapist, and he very gently reminded me that therapy is a process. And over during your discussion about is healing the right word, I was thinking about how healing is also a process. And I would hope that maybe, ideally, if we can allow ourselves to think of healing as a process and not an endpoint, that it takes some of that pressure off to be better, so that we can be in the process and actually move towards getting better. And I just kind of wanted to float that idea.
That's a lovely way to close. Let me just say, the process of writing or reading or listening to poetry is a way to live in response to all of the wounds that human flesh is heir to quote Shakespeare. Not a bad guy to quote. There are so many dehumanizing forces out there in the world. If you think of what's happened to our political discourse, if you think about the excesses of the internet, if you think about just the way people speak to each other and treat each other in this world sometimes, it's a full-time job to try to stay human. You know, and I think the arts are our most crucial tool in doing that. So thank you for supporting us today. Thank you to my wonderful panelists. Thank you to the planning committee. God bless them for putting this together. And let's just try to stay human as much as we can, all right? Thank you. A semi-standing ovation. That's lovely. If you really want your humanity handed to you, you'll come back here at 7 o'clock to hear my best friend in the world, Diane Seuss, read her work. She's going to, I happen to know she's going to take you on a little journey from her early work to her very most recent. And if you've never heard Di read, you have not lived. So we'll see you back here at 7. Yes, we will. Bye.